right. Okay, so what we have here is, as we start lesson 4, Colonial Life, this is a piece of colonial folk art, and what we're looking at is what a normal yeoman farm would have looked like in colonial America. Often when we think about colonial farming, we think that everybody was farming on these large-scale plantations. That just wasn't the norm. This was the norm. A farm that revolved around livestock, multiple crops, and subsistence farming. And you've got to have a lot of different things working in your favor for these farms to thrive and succeed. The reason that I'm starting out with a farm here is because overwhelmingly, most of the labor that existed in colonial America revolved around farming. Even if you were an artisan or another type of labor, there's a pretty decent chance that farming still was some part of your life, whether it was your own subsistence farm or you relied on other farmers in your community for survival. So colonial life in the 1600s, farmers made up most of the colonial labor force. They rose at dawn. They went to bed at dusk. It was grueling labor, and it took generations for these farmers to get start to have success. Because, like I said, you've got to bring in livestock. You've got to be able to appropriately raise livestock, not lose it, not have it killed off. You've got to be able to appropriately grow crops. You can't just survive on the cultivation of tobacco, right? You have to grow corn and beans and squash and all these other types of goods to be able to survive and thrive. And one reason we don't see these colonies thriving until generations later, deeper into the 1600s, is it takes time for these communities to grow. Few events were done at night unless they were worth the candle, because has anyone in here ever made a candle before? All right. Not the easiest process. Might have just done it in like a kit or something. But imagine like how expensive and time consuming it would have been to produce your own candles. You don't want to waste them. So there's a lot of that whole idea of like the hard sort of Protestant work ethic and thrift that's going on colonial farms. They're not wasting anything. Every resource that they have available is being used. Colonial life was quite humble. The majority of the people that immigrated and came into the colonies were lower class. That's not to say that there aren't middle and upper class people who come over and settle, but in the early years, the largest population were lower class, and in many cases, indentured servants who never had a prospect to own land in England or in Europe, so they come to America, roll the dice in order to either gain freedom of religion, the ability to own land, or the opportunity to maybe have wealth that they would never be attainable in Europe. Life in the American wilderness was harsh. Wildlife, diseases, Native American attacks. This was a difficult existence to carve out. And it was also difficult, especially for the lower class, because once they're here, is it easy for them to get back to Europe or back to England? Absolutely not. The price to try to go back would have been higher than just trying to carve out an existence and surviving. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and typhoid killed many settlers. Do you know why I left smallpox out of this go around?
Because they were being used.
Yeah, smallpox is kind of being eradicated at this point. However, in little pockets in the colonies, we'll see like a smallpox epidemic pop up, and then it'll like tamp back down. But we don't really see a really major smallpox problem occur until what event? No. At the end of the colonial period. What war? Very good. We see a massive smallpox outbreak occur during the American Revolution. And that's to your point, a lot of people had just never been around it. Some of them had been inoculated, but some had just never even been exposed to it. Now, there is a smallpox outbreak that occurs in the early 1700s that we're going to talk about, but the big one was when the revolution started. Good job.
Wasn't it also more of a problem for the Native Americans than it was for the settlers?
For sure. Without a doubt. Okay. However, over time, colonists' life expectancy is going to be longer. And what we'll see is this population growth emerge as we move out of the 1600s and into the 1700s. But during the 1600s, the male to female ratio in colonial America was pretty lopsided. 6 males to every 1 female was the ratio. It was a little bit more even in New England because a lot of them had come and settled as what? Families, right? This was a big reason why we saw the bride ships come over. I talked a little bit about that before, right? Yeah. This is where groups of women were brought over to be married off. I don't want you to think these women were just like plucked off the streets of London and it was like, hey, get on this boat and let's go on an adventure. You know, they knew what they were getting into because they actually had to apply for it. So this tells you that these are a group of women who also feel like they don't have prospects in England and that they might have a better future if they go to the colonies, if they go to Virginia. All right. Am I moving too fast? No? We're good? Cool. So colonial life, the economic institutions that were established in the colonies were either uniquely European or uniquely American. And what I mean by this is like, if we looked at like the merchant class, we looked at artisan work or craftsman work. If we look at shipbuilding, these are all uniquely European economic systems. Whereas if we look at tobacco cultivation or the cultivation of rice and indigo or other crops, corn, those are uniquely American. So we have this blend of economic systems happening, and really the economy is all based around these factors: climate, soil condition, and other natural resources in a region. Like if you lived in Connecticut, you weren't going to be able to thrive as a tobacco farmer. If you lived in Virginia, you weren't going to be able to successfully grow sugar. See where I'm going with this? It's kind of like Jared Diamond's theory is creeping back up here. Yeah.
Doesn't it also cause like some of the people who stayed loyal to the England during the Revolutionary War?
Very good. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that momentarily. There's a strong belief in private ownership, especially of land, and there's also this belief in free enterprise, the ability to own your own farm or own your own business and successfully thrive in that business. But this creates a clash of culture with the natives because most of the natives that broker these deals, these trade deals, or these land deals, they believe they're giving these colonists the right to do what? Well, that's actually a good point. But they actually believe that these are just trade opportunities. They don't expect these people to stay forever, right? So that they also don't view land ownership in the same light as the Europeans do. So the institution of slavery also influenced European and African life in the colonies. And again, very early on, we are going to see some early free African and African American communities, not on a large scale. we're also going to learn about what codes affected them as well. What codes are going to be passed that affect both African American slaves and free African Americans? Not yet. It's a good guess. Not yet. They're called the what codes? Slave codes, okay? Or Barbados codes. So, another piece of folk art here. We have, what are these women making on a large scale?
Candles.
They're making candles. Yeah. This seems like a menial task. For us today, making candles would probably be a hobby. Or maybe just something that we do to, I don't know, therapy? I don't know. I'm not, my kids make candles all the time. They don't even burn them. It's like, what are we doing here? It's like time consuming and a huge mess, right? My children and their candle production has nothing to do with survival, right? It's like something for them to do to destroy the kitchen and put us on edge. For these folks, candle production was a way of life. Everything. What else are they having to produce piecemeal? Clothes, shoes, tools, guns. I mean, everything's having to be built by hand because most of the lower class cannot afford to buy finished goods coming in from Europe. Another thing we have to remember too, there's just not a lot of cash flow in the colonies. So their assets are growing out of the ground or they're producing them and making them for their own use. That's what we call piecemeal work. All right? So, Southern colonial society. What we start to see occur in colonial Virginia, colonial Carolina, colonial Maryland, and later colonial Georgia, we start to see like this pyramid happen. It's like a triangle. And we have at the very top of the triangle, the very wealthy nobility, and then everybody else is beneath them. The middle class isn't super large, but the lower class is predominantly made up of indentured servants and slaves. And the very top of this group are often known as the Virginia Cavaliers. These were people that were loyal to the Anglican Church and loyal to the crown. Good point earlier. They got these massive land grants. Predominantly, are y'all familiar with the area known as the Tidewater? Right? This is the area below Richmond, all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic. This territory over here, along the Tidewater, was territory that was rich for growing what? Tobacco. Very good. All right. Not that there wasn't rich farmland to the west. These were just huge tracts of land that were valuable to these nobility. Now, Cavaliers under the reign of James I, Charles I, there's a little bit of a stall during Cromwell's time, but a lot of Anglicans leave England and come to Virginia. And then this is resurrected during Charles II's reign after the Restoration. These massive land grants are doled out, and we end up having what are called the FFVs, the First Families of Virginia. These are all names that everyone is quite familiar with. The Custuses, the Jeffersons, the Randolphs, the Lees, the Washingtons. They're like Virginia royalty, Virginia nobility. They have the nicest tracts of land along navigable waterways in and around the Tidewater. They also dominate the House of Burgesses. What college did Thomas Jefferson found? UVA. He went to William and Mary. Okay. What is the University of Virginia's mascot? Cavaliers. Jefferson is a descendant of the Cavaliers. he is a descendant of the FFEs, the First Families of Virginia. In fact, a lot of these families are intertwined together. And to the point made earlier over here, when the war breaks out, this is actually going to divide some of these families, notably the Randolphs. We'll talk more about that division as we move forward, but there are Randolphs that don't stay in Virginia when the war breaks out. Some of them actually leave and go to England because they want to remain loyal. So there is a heavy sort of allegiance to the Anglican Church. There's also an allegiance to the crown, at least until we get to the dawn of the American Revolution, and then we're going to see a splintering. We'll talk more about that as we move forward. I don't want to get ahead of myself. As we move farther into the west, into the Shenandoah Valley and Appalachia, we start to see a different flavor here. We see a flavor of English, Scots-Irish, and German. How many of you guys have been to Harrisonburg, Roanoke, or Blacksburg in the last year? Okay? Then if you've been there, then you've traveled through the Shenandoah Valley. And if you look on either side of Interstate 81, you'll notice there's lots and lots of farms and cows, right? But there's also lots of barns. And if you look at the barns going up and down the Shenandoah Valley, those barns have distinct different architecture based on who settled there. Some of the barns have more of a Scots-Irish style of architecture, where others have more English, others more German. Also, fun fact for you guys, you can tell your families, if you're ever going south through the Shenandoah Valley, you're actually going up the valley. And if you're going north, you're going down the valley. Because most of the people that came through here would go through passes or go through Philadelphia, and they would travel north to south to go in and settle it. And as you go south, the elevation goes up. So they would say, we are going up the valley, going from north to south. It's kind of weird to think of it that way, but I thought you guys would find that interesting. Do keep in mind that there are very few city commercial centers in the American South. Really, there's only one to speak of, and that's Charleston. All the others are just like little commercial centers like Norfolk, Wilmington. These would have just been small little city centers, right? Charleston was a much bigger trade center. Like Richmond was just this tiny little village. How many of you guys have been down to Churchill before? Okay, so Churchill to Rockets Landing, that was pretty much Richmond. What really puts Richmond on the map is going to be the post-revolutionary era and the building of what? What's downtown?
What's the government building?
Well, that'll happen later. No, I'm talking about down in the bottom.
Oh.
What's down in the bottom that allowed for trade in Richmond? Before that, the canal. The Kanawha Canal. Yeah, the James River Canal system, okay? We'll get into that a bit later, all right? The South will get its first college. The College of William and Mary will be established in Williamsburg in 1693. Initially, it was established to educate Anglican clergy, but over time, it is going to change its curriculum toward classical and education and law as well, all right? Which will ultimately lead to people like Thomas Jefferson going to school for law, among others, all right? Any comments, questions, concerns up to this point? This is the College of William and Mary. I'm going to talk more about this style of architecture later. It's called Georgian style architecture. Anybody visited William and Mary before? A couple of you guys? All right. Check it out if you ever get the chance. Pretty amazing. All right. This is mostly old news. This is some review, but there's a new part to this that is very important. As we know, cash crop economies dominated the South, right? The Chesapeake, tobacco, the Carolinas, indigo and rice. Everybody was growing corn. This is where we start to see larger plantations emerge in the coastal region of these colonies. The Chesapeake colonies were exporting 1.5 million pounds of tobacco annually in the 1630s. By 1700, they're producing 1 million pounds per year. That's crazy. This also leads to tobacco prices going down, and now you've got, an issue with supply and demand, right? Who's going to buy the tobacco? This is where people want to start selling it to anybody, which creates problems, right? Because they're selling it to not just England, but to other countries, and that's illegal because they're doing what? If they're illegally selling goods, this is called what? It starts with an S. Smuggling. Very good. They're smuggling these goods to other countries. That creates controversy. Another really important moment in the colonial South is what is going to be called the headright system. The headright system was a system that was put into place to encourage more people to not only come over, but it also encouraged super wealthy people to pay for the passage of indentured servants. So here's the premise. For every indentured servant that you pay passage for, you receive 50 acres of land. Now, if you're super wealthy and you can afford to send 50 or 100 indentured servants over and pay their way, you've got a whole lot more land than just a patroonship, right? You're sitting on a plantation. And that is why a lot of the nobility are able to get these massive tracts of land. But then, somebody out there mentioned this earlier, what happens when their contracts are up, right? You've got all this land, where's your labor force? And you're not interested in giving this farmable land up to any of them. So this is another reason why we see a movement away from indentured servitude and toward chattel slavery. All right? So the headright system, it's kind of like the patroonship system, but it doesn't get parceled up the way that you might think. It actually ends up becoming large-scale, massive plantations with lots of indentured servants and slaves. Yes?
So were these really rich and wealthy people, were they buying indentured servants for themselves or just to be
It would vary.
Okay.
Some of them would send them over with this whole idea of feudalism where they're like, yes, we're going to have these, this is going to be serfdom and we're going to have these people work. And then some of these people get stuck, right? They're like, oh, well, I got my freedom and now I can't get any land, so I'm just going to stay here and work.
Yeah.
Right.
That would mean that all of their farms are getting run by people whose work is going to stop. And so is that what led to more chattel slavery?
Yep, totally. So early on, most of the laborers were indentured servants. Life was not great. Hope of freedom. Most contracts were 7 years. Some were more, some were less. It just kind of depends, right? Your chances of dying before seeing your freedom were better than actually seeing your freedom as a result of famine and abuses and disease and all the other ways to die. Conditions were brutal. The living arrangements were horrible. And another thing too, a lot of the indentured servants were illiterate. So if they were illiterate,
So their contracts would.
they don't know what their contract says. So they might end up signing a contract and then violating a contract and just having more years added to their time. That was constant. So a lot of indentured servants are going to uproot and run away to Appalachia. And we're going to actually talk about sort of this melting pot group of marine societies that end up becoming established in Appalachia as a result of runaway indentured servants and later runaway slaves. This is a very interesting primary document. This is a primary document. It's advertising for indentured servants to go to Virginia. And it says, wanted, to go to Virginia under indentures for a few years. What's a few years? Is it 3? Is it 7? Is it 10? We don't know, right? This is quite vague. A young man who understands Latin, Greek, and mathematics to serve, not ferve. This is an Old English lowercase s here. To serve as a tutor in a gentleman's family. Now, this guy is probably going to be in decent shape and have the ability to negotiate a contract because what does he have going for him? He has an education. So this would probably be like a middle-class servant that might be stuck in a primogeniture situation and have greater opportunity. A lad who has served an apprenticeship as a surgeon to live with one of his own profession. So if this kid has a strong stomach and a steady hand, congratulations, you're a surgeon. But how long is his contract? What's his job? Just like, disposing of severed limbs? Who knows? Yeah.
That's what lowercase s is used to be.
Yeah. Isn't that weird?
It's like an F.
Yeah. It's kind of goofy. 2 gardeners who understand their business well, particularly the work in a garden. Now, do you think, what if they get here and they're like, oh, cool, we're going to be planting hydrangeas. Oh, no, actually, you're going to be working in a tobacco field for 7 years. I'd have a couple more gardeners on board. See where I'm going with this? This is a very vague situation. These properly recommended will meet with suitable encouragement on applying to Buchanan and Simpson in Glasgow, merchants in Glasgow. So find that interesting. Okay, frustrated freemen and Bacon's rebellion. So over a few generations, we have a growing group of indentured servants who have gained freedom, both of English and African descent, but they are not receiving the promises that they had been given upon their freedom. Meaning that they're poor, they're landless, they're single, and they don't really have all the best prospects of owning land in Tidewater. So a lot of these folks end up uprooting and going deeper west toward the Piedmont and the Shenandoah Valley. But what groups are already there? Native Americans. Very good. Native Americans are already there. And there are some powerful tribes in the region. Algonquian, Shawnee, Susquehanna, Cherokee. And as more and more settlers move in to create permanent settlements, the Native American raids ramp up. And Nathaniel Bacon decides he is going to lead a crusade against the royal government led by William Berkeley and what he and his followers, overwhelmingly former indentured servants of English and African descent, what they're going to do is march on Jamestown and burn the place to the ground, which they do. Now, Bacon dies of dysentery before the rebellion is put down. After he dies, it becomes less organized, and then when it's put down, his leaders are going to be rounded up and executed. This is also sort of the issue of paranoia because the nobility not only those who are in the House of Burgesses, but other powerful landowners in Eastern Virginia are thinking, wait a minute, we can't have former indentured servants rising up and leading rebellions. This is going to create too many problems. This is sort of the final straw that pushes Virginia and other colonies, notably the southern colonies, to move away from indentured servitude and toward chattel slavery. But all these other variables are in play that you all talked about earlier. We see a decline in the population of indentured servants and an increase in the population of chattel slaves from Africa being brought in during this period of time. At the end of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s. This is also the period of time when the Barbados codes, or the slave codes, start to be moved. They go from the Caribbean to Virginia and the Carolinas and Maryland. And by the 1700s, guys, every colony, all of them, from New England all the way down to Georgia, by the 1740s, they all have slave codes in place, which is horribly tragic. So on the left, we have Bacon. How am I looking?
327.
Beautiful. We have Bacon on the left. There in the middle, we have Bacon and Berkeley. And then on the right, we have the most famous painting of Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, this is mainly review. The next one, though, that I'm going to cover is new information. So I like to say this, put it this way. I don't agree with plantation needs. I think it's wants. They didn't need indentured servants. They didn't need slaves. They wanted that. They wanted cheap labor. As more slaves are brought along the triangular trade route in the Middle Passage, we start to see the phase out of indentured servitude. Now, in the early years in Virginia and Maryland, Africans that arrived were put on indentures. And many of them that survived did gain freedom, but that freedom is only limited because most of those folks had to adhere to the slave codes once they were passed. All right? Remember, the first group arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Following the events of Bacon's Rebellion, that's when it's wholesale chattel slavery and slave codes in colonial America. By the early 1700s, African slaves outnumbered white servants throughout the South. By 1750, half of the population of Virginia was enslaved or of African descent. Over half of the population in the Carolinas. Where were these folks coming from? West Africa, Congo, Senegal, Angola. Remember, some slaves gained early freedom. Some slaves, rarely, but some, had the ability to own slaves themselves, but their slaves could not be what? White. That was part of the slave codes. African slaves could not own white indentured servants. Some slaves gained their freedom, but really there's only three ways in which they could gain their freedom. Finishing an indentured contract, purchasing their freedom, or being freed by their slave owner. Running away does not make them free. See where I'm going with that? So a lot of runaway indentured servants and runaway slaves end up forming what are called maroon societies. These are societies that were often early on mixed race societies made up of African, English, and Native Americans. And these societies, the descendants of these societies still live in parts of Appalachia. Eventually, though, the slave codes, as I previously mentioned, became universal. What did the slave codes do? It gave them no rights. Okay? Marriages were not acknowledged. children were born into slavery. Thank you. Children were born into slavery. They couldn't trade with free white settlers. Curfews were put into place. The list goes on and on. So on the top left, we have the Middle Passage. Bottom left, that is a colonial slave auction. And over on the right, similar to the advertisement we saw for the indentured servants, this advertisement is an advertisement for slaves being sold in the Carolinas. And one of the biggest announcements at the bottom of this is they're free of smallpox. It's absolutely horrific. Okay, this is where I pump the brakes today. Thank you, though. You're here. I appreciate you. Good, Joey. All right. So, slave life in the southern colonies was brutal because most of that was based in agriculture and based in cash crops. Tobacco, rice, indigo, corn, wherever they were, whether it was the Chesapeake or the Carolinas, or even further in the deeper south of Georgia. What we see, though, is Africans start to blend their language, their traditions, their religion, their culture, their music, their folklore. It all starts to interblend and intermingle with that of English, French, Spanish. It all starts to come together. If you are a fan of folk music, many of the instruments that we hold dear in folk music, like the banjo and the bongo drums, were brought over by Africans. And these were actually put into the slave codes as well in some colonies where music was banned from Africans. So it was illegal for them to play their music. So they had to do it in secret. Not all the colonies banned it, though. Slaves made so many contributions and so many are lost to history. We're going to talk about a really important contribution as we move forward in this lesson. Some slaves became skilled artisans, carpenters, bricklayers, tanners. One of the most famous examples is Black Ned Tarr of Augusta County. He was a colonial blacksmith. He was free. He bought his freedom. And in the colonial period, he married a white woman. That was absolutely unheard of during this period of time. Most slaves were regulated to back-breaking labor, and the poor treatment of slaves and the passage of slave codes ultimately led to these slave revolts. In the colonial period alone, it's estimated that there were over 250. I'm only making you responsible for two of them. You need to know the New York City Slave Revolt, and you need to know the Stoner Rebellion. These will not be the last slave revolts that we learn about in this class, but these are the two main ones that occurred in the colonial period. The New York City Slave Revolt was launched in 1712 because a series of harsh slave codes that looked very similar to the ones in the Deep South were passed in New York. These were so controversial that a group of slaves rose up, 12 settlers were killed, and 21 slaves were executed when the rebellion was put down. The largest slave revolt that occurred in colonial America was the Stoner Rebellion. How many of you guys have been to Charleston, South Carolina? Okay, this revolt occurred outside of Charleston on a tributary of the Stoner River called Wallace Creek. This is called the Stoner Rebellion. A slave named Jimmy in 1739 got a group of slaves together, armed, rise up, and march south to Florida. Any idea why? Who had occupation of Florida? Spain. And what Spain had done was passed a decree that any British African slave that safely made their way to Florida would receive their freedom. So it's kind of crazy because when we typically think about slaves gaining freedom, we think about the Underground Railroad traveling north to Canada. But in this situation, there were slaves trying to get south to Florida to basically get into the hands of the Spanish. ultimately that rebellion was put down. So, this is going to just persist, this issue of enslavement, and then it will persist into the early new nation, and it will truly become the foundation of what will lead to the American Civil War, which we'll talk about later.
How do they know that they'd be free and for?
That is a wild part about this, because somebody in that group had to be literate, and somebody in that group had to be able to read Spanish, which I think is remarkable, right? Not to mention, they're actually marching with banners that said liberty. So once that rebellion was put down, almost universally, the colonies banned literacy among slaves. I'm glad you brought that up. All right. So this is a historic marker outside of Charleston for the Stono Rebellion. The largest slave insurrection in British North America began nearby on September 9th, 1739. About 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stono River, taking guns and other weapons. They killed 2 shopkeepers. The rebels marched south toward promised freedom in Spanish Florida, waving flags, beating drums, and shouting liberty. Okay. So, questions for me? Comments, concerns? All right.